No one is talking about nuclear policy in this election. A physics professor at Illinois State University says maybe they should.
I think that the risk of a nuclear war is as high as it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Learn about a new WGLT podcast on today's Sound Ideas. Good afternoon, I'm Lauren Warnicki. Also on today's show, ISU hosts a film and speaker series to provide historical context about this year's election.
Today's kind of politics and media are not new.
And a new volleyball club in Bloomington-Normal caters to boys.
I saw literally like 12 groups of boys peppering in random locations, and I was like, okay, that's it. Like, we need to have a boys team here.
All that coming up after a Bloomington-Normal news update. This is Sound Ideas on 89.1 WGLT and WGLT.org, part of the NPR network.
Support for WGLT comes from Bloomington-Normal Audiology. Hear My Story continues with local patient David Fedor.
Probably my favorite feature is Bluetoothing my phone through them so that I can have a phone conversation. And the clarity that I'm getting is tremendous. So the technology is amazing.
David's full story can be found at bnaudiology.com.
Campus of Illinois State University in Normal, this is WGLT's news magazine Sound Ideas. I'm Lauren Warnicki. 9 countries have enough nuclear weapons stockpiled to destroy the globe 8 times over. It's about 12,000 bombs, and most of them belong to the United States and Russia. WGLT's new 12,000 Bombs podcast examines the election issue no one is really talking about, nuclear policy, featuring scholars and policy advocates visiting Illinois State University this fall. Today on Sound Ideas, we play an excerpt of the first episode, exploring the background of the United States nuclear program. And we answer questions like, what's the football? And why is the president the only person who can authorize a nuclear strike? Matt Kaplan is a nuclear physicist and physics professor at ISU, and really, 12,000 bombs was all his idea. Let's pick up with our discussion with recent political campaigns, which have focused less on policy and more on temperament.
Imagine him in the Oval Office facing a real crisis. A man you can bait with a tweet is not a man we can trust with nuclear weapons.
It is never a question of what the policy around that arsenal is or whether or not we should have it.
Nuclear policy is a really, really big thing, and it's an octopus with a lot of tentacles that works its way into everything from pork barrel spending to fund the guy who's running for Congress whose district builds certain components of the missile, to how the United States is going to stare down China over the next 25 years as China builds up its arsenal to prepare to take Taiwan. So this is a really huge issue, and nuclear weapons are really embedded in U.S. culture. But something that you can vote on beyond just temperament is a maybe hawk or dove mentality. And so if we want to talk specifically about the 2 candidates running, we do have some sense of how we can predict they would behave. Kamala Harris has not given detailed plans for the future of the nuclear arsenal, but the nuclear arsenal is due for what they're calling modernization. There's a plan to spend $1.5 trillion in the coming decades to completely replace and update with entirely new weapons, hypersonic missiles and the like, the entire U.S. nuclear arsenal. And it's a question of whether or not all of this is necessary, or if the same deterrence could be achieved with fewer missiles, or whether the United States can use this as a time to say, hey, Russia and the other nuclear powers, rather than undergoing this modernization campaign and spending this money and then causing you to go spend money where you have to update your weapons in response, perhaps we can agree to some treaty limitations. And then everybody sort of gets a win out of it. This is how treaties have been born in the past, is out of countries trying to stall the arms race, and it's for domestic benefit as much as it is for strategic security.
This is a person who has been very cavalier, even casual, about the use of nuclear weapons. He's advocated more countries getting them, Japan, Korea, even Saudi Arabia. He said, well, if we have them, why don't we use them, which I think is terrifying. But here's the deal. The bottom line on nuclear weapons is that when the president gives the order, it must be followed.
if I can sort of offer opinion as sort of an observer, the nuclear military during the Trump administration really treated it like a blank check. Is a lot of these new ideas that are coming out that hypersonics are essential and these new low yield tactical weapons are essential in order to respond in a crisis where we might need a 5 kiloton weapon. These were born out of the Trump administration and the Heritage Foundation, who inform a lot of his basically create his policies, I would think is fair to say. And so we could expect this to increase. Project 2025 says in very clear terms that they want a really aggressive expansion in arms production beyond this $1.5 trillion program that I've already described. $1.5 trillion is a lot. The Sentinel missile program is already about 80% over budget, which would replace the silos out west. And there's really serious questions about whether or not silos, which invite an attack on US soil, are really essential or useful in the next generation of strategic deterrence. So many of the things that you might think about the candidates' temperaments and how they approach the other issues, that's going to inform how they're going to approach nuclear policy.
The period around 9/11 and the authorization of going into Iraq, I'm not old enough to have really known every detail of how that transpired, but I know Dick Cheney had a lot to do with it. He was really someone who pushed for this idea of the unitary executive. So I wonder what his endorsement says.
Dick Cheney, your father, a beloved figure among Democrats for many, many years. Do you, if you know who he will be supporting or who he'll be voting for, do you care to share with us who he might be voting for?
Dick Cheney will be voting for Kamala Harris.
Okay. Wow. Words I never expected to hear.
Yeah. You know, if you think about the moment that we're in, and you think about how serious this moment is. You know, my dad believes, and he's said publicly, that there's never been an individual in our country who is as grave a threat to our democracy as Donald Trump is. And that's the moment that we're facing.
Donald Trump is unique as a candidate who has the nomination of his party and does not have the clear support of very other big figures in his party. And that also includes figures like Mitt Romney, for example. I don't think we've seen anything similar for Kamala Harris. There has been a very sort of big tent movement among the Democrats. And even with policy differences from different factions of the party, there don't seem to be the same questions of temperament and fitness and mental acuity that plagued the more senior candidates, Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
Has there ever really been a candidate that's part of their platform is like, I don't think we should do this anymore?
Yes, actually. So in the 1980s, at the peak of the sort of second half of the Cold War, after the détente, when things were relatively stable, I would say, between the US and Russia, there was that big spike in the number of weapons being produced. NATO was very itchy. They were very worried that it was finally coming to a head and it was going to happen. The big one was coming. And this was a very popular political stance in the United States and in continental Europe, that this is out of control and something has to be done. This is not right. And so you could run in the 1980s on a platform of enough is enough. When are we going to put the military spending in check? And sure enough, these mass movements actually were instrumental in creating arms control talks with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could see very visibly that there was this grassroots demand from a big tent. It was everything from environmentalists to people thinking about budgets to high-minded theorists of war. All were coming out in this big tent being opposed to the nuclear arms race that was happening. And so one could imagine this being a real position that politicians will have to take. And I haven't seen it on people's platforms. If I scroll through candidates for Congress, they'll have a few sentences about Russia and Ukraine. But I think we watched the debate and the words nuclear weapons came out of one candidate's mouth once.
If Donald Trump were president, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. And understand what that would mean, because Putin's agenda is not just about Ukraine. Understand why the European allies and our NATO allies are so thankful that you are no longer president and that we understand the importance of the greatest military alliance the world has ever known, which is NATO, and what we have done to preserve the ability of Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight for their independence.
Putin would be sitting in Moscow, and he wouldn't have lost 300,000 men and women, but he would have been sitting in Moscow. Quiet, please. He would have been sitting in Moscow much happier than he is right now. But eventually, he's got a thing that other people don't have. He's got nuclear weapons. They don't ever talk about that. He's got nuclear weapons. Nobody ever thinks about that. And eventually, maybe he'll use them, and maybe he hasn't been that threatening, but he does have that. Something we don't even
If it's not really being mentioned on candidates' platforms now, it was in the 80s. Compare that to the threat level of then versus now. Is this something that we need to be talking more about?
Absolutely, 100%. I think that the risk of a nuclear war is as high as it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, said over the weekend that the United States has never been this close as it is now, to nuclear war. Do you agree with him?
Yeah, I do.
12,000 Bombs is a partnership between WGLT and ISU professor Matt Kaplan. Matt's companion speaker series takes place on select Tuesdays this fall. That series kicked off this evening. You can listen to the whole first episode with updates throughout election season wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up tomorrow on Sound Ideas, a conversation with golf legend Lee Trevino. He's coming to Bloomington-Normal next month as the Red Cross Evening of Stars featured speaker. That's on tomorrow's show. It's Sound Ideas. I'm Lauren Warnicki. Next, a conversation from our Democracy's Future podcast. That's a joint venture between WGLT and the Vidette, the student voice of Illinois State University. ISU is hosting a speaker series called Democracy Focus and a film series on politics and the media to help frame the 2024 elections. Megan Leonard is Associate Chair of the Department of Politics and Government. She coordinated the speaker series, and the first event is Wednesday afternoon on mobilizing the politically invisible, the Latino population. Lauren Bratslavsky, an associate professor in ISU's School of Communications, coordinated the film series at the Normal Theater. It kicked off last night with 1957's A Face in the Crowd. Up next is 1972's The Candidate, starring Robert Redford on September 30th. Then on October 14th is The Campaign, a 2012 piece starring Will Ferrell and Zach Galifianakis. In this podcast excerpt, Bratslavsky tells WGLT's student reporter Paul J. Aguilar what she hopes viewers will take away from these films from different eras.
My biggest interest in putting together this film series, two out of the three are a lot more historical than the third one, but still more than 10 years old. And I think for each of these, they're good opportunities to do that, compare and contrast. What are some things that seem pretty similar to today as a way to learn that today's kind of politics and media are not new. We've seen these kinds of things before, as far as like polarization or how news media or kind of the public imaging of candidates have happened. So that's a big one, to see some of those continuities. And of course also the changes to compare to today.
And Megan, what would you have to say?
So in our speaker series, what we want to gain is a discussion about some of the topics most relevant to the election with experts who spend their time studying those topics. So whether that's Latino political participation, conspiracy theories, political violence, student protests, all of these are really important issues. And on campus, we have a really great support system for students to be registered to vote. And so we wanted to add to that by adding discussions about topics really, central to this year's election.
So Megan, what kinds of questions are you getting from students about the election and about democracy?
think the students are engaged and excited, if in some ways frustrated by the election cycle. One of the things I hear from most of our students is, why do we only have two choices, right? And they see themselves either somewhere in the middle or somewhere different than the candidates, and they feel like the candidates maybe aren't relating to their generation. So a lot of it is, I think, some consternation with how the election cycle is going. But more generally, I think most of what we want to get to right now is, and what our students are concerned with is, how do I make sure that I am ready to vote in November?
That was ISU professors Megan Leonard and Lauren Bratzlavsky speaking with WGLT student reporter Paul J. Aguilar. You can get more information on the film series at WGLT.org. And you can find the entire conversation on the Democracy's Future podcast. Subscribe to the Democracy's Future on the NPR app or wherever you listen. Stories and conversations from Bloomington-Normal and McLean County, it's Sound Ideas. I'm Lauren Warnicki. 6 weeks ago, Central Illinois native Amy Biles launched a new volleyball club in Bloomington. It was aimed at catering to a market few, if any, in the area are really serving: boys. The hope was to have enough of a turnout to create boys teams that could play others in the state, but Biles has had to do some pivoting since that didn't happen. But she tells WGLT's Lindsay Jones she's confident that now that she's built it, they will eventually come.
The reason that this all started was because I took an opportunity in HR and it just wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. And so I kind of had a whole midlife crisis, I guess, for a millennial. And, it just wasn't a good cultural fit. Real. And so I decided to quit my job. And then I was just going to do girls, but I was kind of looking at, the environment. I was starting my business plan, looking at the environment here. And in the same week, the Pantograph posted an article about Michael Coleman's son, who drives all the way to Joliet to play competitive volleyball. And then, I kid you not, I saw boys peppering, which is just a simple playing volleyball on the side, not a real game. I saw literally 12 groups of boys peppering in random locations. And I was like, okay, that's it. We need to have a boys team here. And I know it's going to be slow to develop, but we're getting there.
So tell me a little bit about some of the challenges in getting that started.
So I think there's a lot of different reasons why it's struggled in Central Illinois. First is we don't have a club devoted to boys. So I promised to protect this space and to go with the mantra, if I build it, they will come. They're not here yet, but they will come. And I'm faithful. I'm very, very faithful that that's going to happen. But I think for here in Central Illinois, it's kind of a Title IX issue, right? So they're even right now. The sports are. And so that's why it's been a struggle to get it in school. But then in terms of the smaller schools too, when you have a small school, especially some of the small private schools like Calvary or even Central Catholic, these kids are playing multiple sports, and the teams literally don't exist if these kids don't play baseball and basketball and volleyball. And when volleyball for boys doesn't have a set, the club season overlaps multiple sports. Yeah. And so that's a barrier right there, right? As a club, we have to be flexible to those schedules and to allow these athletes to pursue multiple passions.
So tell me a little bit logistically about how the model is working. So you've been open 6 weeks. What does it look like when you're in here on Monday and Friday nights?
Logistically, it is, I would say, a lot of pivot, right? That scene from Friends where they're like, pivot, right? So we had boys tryouts, and that's exactly we started with boys tryouts. We didn't really host any open gyms just because the club schedule, and when I started this, it was time to go. And unfortunately, that didn't pan out. So we were like, okay, what does the community need? The community needs opportunities to explore that volleyball is even a thing. And they need drop-ins. Parents have told me that they need flexibility. So I'm just trying to kind of adjust to that. I think I am kind of thinking about the pipeline though and building how I'm going to build the club. And so I'm looking into the future, and there's a couple times over November and December where I'm going to do 3-week mini seasons, like introduction to volleyball for elementary kids and junior hires. And I hope to just, get them in an hour per practice, and just get them going. Currently it's been growth, right? So, the first night at tryouts, we had about 10 athletes in here. And then this last week, we had 11 athletes total for the 2 open gyms. So the goal is to just keep it nice and simple until we consistently have about 14 athletes. And then from there, we'll start breaking it down and growing into different sessions in that sense.
Yeah. For any of the boys that have come in so far, have you been able to have discussions with any of their parents or any of their families, or even with them about the barriers that exist to getting into volleyball, specifically for boys in Central Illinois?
Yeah. There's a very strong group that were from Peoria. These boys were incredibly good. Another barrier that was really, really difficult is the age groups. Because for tryouts, I had 10 kids, but they were all different ages, and the way that boys develop and the way that girls develop, I could probably throw a 15-year-old girl and a 17-year-old girl on the same team, and it be pretty consistent play. And boys, that 15 age group to that 17 age group is drastically different. That's a lot of development between those 2 age groups. And I'm just talking the speed at which they hit the ball, the force behind it, that's a lot different. And so the age groups was hard. But honestly, I spoke with parents in Peoria and Champaign, and they both just said, the distance is kind of hard. So ideally there is a team in Springfield. Springfield Shock now has a boys program. They're in their 3rd year, and they've got a team, and I'm working closely with that director to try and build up here so that we can compete with them, right? But ideally, if we had Champaign and Peoria and maybe Decatur, if we had boys teams in each of those locations, we could have an affordable program for boys to compete locally. We wouldn't need to go to Chicago or to St. Louis. So we need one in each spot. We'll get there.
Yeah.
That was Normal Flight Volleyball Club founder Amy Biles speaking to WGLT's Lindsay Jones. You can read that full story at WGLT.org. Thanks for choosing WGLT's Sound Ideas, made possible in part by Bloomington-Normal Audiology. I'm Lauren Warnicki. We had story help today from WGLT's Lindsay Jones and student reporter Paul J. Aguilar. Bren McMonigal edits the show. This is 89.1 WGLT and WGLT.org, part of the NPR network.